Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there, very good evening. Welcome to another edition of Newsline Live. We're coming to you live and direct from our Newsfirst studios here in Colombo. Sri Lanka is still in crisis. We don't know when this crisis will end. A lot of changes are being made right now, and there are people with different opinions about these changes that are being made. We are focusing today on one specific area where changes are about to be made, at least here in Sri Lanka, that would affect each and every person in this country. This is because these changes are to be made to the labor laws in Sri Lanka. Many Sri Lankans would be an employee. There are a few who are employers. They too will be affected by these labor laws and will be governed by them. But a vast majority of Sri Lankans will definitely be affected in one way or another. It could be good, it could be bad. And to discuss these matters with us, we've got with us Peter de Almeida. He is the General Secretary, Deputy General Secretary, I beg your pardon, of the Ceylon Mercantile, Industrial and General Workers Union, the CMU. Good evening, Peter, and welcome to the show.
Good evening, Shalan. It's lovely to be with you on the show.
Lovely to have you on the show, Peter. Starting off, Peter, labor laws in Sri Lanka. There are people who do know about the laws, labor laws here in Sri Lanka. There are people who do not know. In general, they are laws that have been put in place to bring about some balance due to the disparity in power between the employer and the employee. Now, as the Deputy General Secretary of the CMU, do you think that labor laws in Sri Lanka should be changed at all?
Largely, I would say, to answer the question more generally, no, because it should be strengthened in that sense, change to strengthen the law, not to weaken it. So if you are saying change to strengthen the law, yes, for sure. But to your question, because your audience, you say, don't understand, you see, let me quickly, today I had a very interesting chat with a lawyer called Mr. Shah Mohammed, who is a friend of our union, and he's done a lot of great work for working people and their rights and so on. He made a very interesting point. He said, you see, labor laws are very unique. They are part of contract. It's a contract. You're a lawyer, you know this. But you see, what happened was, in the early days, employer had a contract with the employee because labor was a commodity. So like contract covers goods and services.
Yeah.
So it was like that. But there was a power imbalance. The employer had the power when a worker comes to join the company. So he can offer him whatever term he wants. And that fellow, because, needs a job badly, he will accept the offer. And it can have varied terms, generally exploitative terms. So as we progressed with the ILO and all of that, and workers fighting for rights, it became clear that to avoid that kind of a imbalanced, extremely unfair contracts for workers, they brought statutory laws. That is the essence of labor law. So statutory laws are brought in to prevent that kind of power imbalance, where contracts are then made to keep the employer in a more advantageous position. Now, what this law tries to do, the changes they're proposing, do just the opposite. They want to now make labor a commodity with no protection. Just go to the market, remove the statutory protections, and put the workers at the mercy of an employer when they're joining an employment. So that's the fundamental principle. This goes against the grain of what the ILO and all that over the years we have built. So to your point, the key laws that protect, one is the termination of employment of workers. Now there is an act. Now that is what people can hire and fire. No? How can you plan your family and then you understand? I don't have to explain that. Then maternity benefits, women's rights, maternity, women, that's a huge section protected by the laws today, maternity benefits. And night work for women. Now today, if you work till 11 o'clock in the night, they'll give you 500 rupees and say you take a tuk-tuk and go home. Can they step onto the road at 10 o'clock, at 9 o'clock at night?
But more to that, Peter, I don't think you get a 500 rupee tuk home.
Good point. Good point. That's also true. They'll give them 500, you have to fork out another $1,000 of your own. I mean, these have evolved as society has developed from slavery These have evolved so that workers and women and others enjoy some protection. These are removed. Working hours, how did this 8-hour working day come? I think Bala Tampo was talking about it. You divide the 24 hours a day into 3. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for leisure with your family and others, and you are other workmen, you have to do other things, no? So that's how it came about. Now they are trying to change that. So these are, 8-hour day was fought with blood spilled in the famous May Day, Haymarket massacre. The May Day comes from that, where people fought for it. The police opened fire and people died. So people have given up their lives to protect this. And now this government, which has no legitimacy, I must point out, to make any changes. It's a government that lacks legitimacy, maybe legal, to come and make drastic changes affecting the lives of millions of workers. So that has to be completely resisted.
But Peter, now, like I said at the beginning of the program, we're in the midst of a crisis. So
yes.
Everything that we discuss right now should be taken in that context.
Absolutely.
I mean, under normal conditions, if Sri Lanka wasn't a bankrupt nation, if we didn't make the mistakes in the past that we did when we elected our leaders, when we put people who are not suitable to be in those positions into those positions, if we made those right decisions, if it was a time like that, then this discussion would have been quite different. But in the midst of this crisis, the biggest argument that is being propounded for change, at least, is the fact that Sri Lanka's labor laws do not promote investment. And given the situation that Sri Lanka is in right now, we need investment.
Yes. Great question, Shal, and I knew you would bring this up. Now, let's take that head on. To pull ourselves out of this crisis today, with the $80 billion debt, what do we need? We need high quality investment, massive investment, not these fly-by-night investors who come, who will expect you to provide cheap, subservient labor. That's not the kind of investment you need. You need top quality investment. Now, very interestingly, what is stopping our investment? Now that you spoke about the government and all that, the main thing, one of the key things that's stopping it, that quality, that kind of investment, is corruption. You know what happened with Taisei? Now Taisei is a global company, Japanese company. They came and they told the government that one of the ministers asked for a bribe. What did the government do? Had an inquiry under this president. Inquiry and said no. In fact, they called out, they told the Japanese ambassador, because the ambassador made the allegation, and the Japanese government by the extension said, you are a liar. Now the Japanese are waiting to give their return when these guys go to negotiate the debt with Japan. But you see, still massive scale corruption. That's one. Secondly, let's talk specifically about this investment. Now there was a famous study done by Ricardo Hausmann of Harvard University Center for International Development, CID. This was commissioned, this was during the time when the current president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, was the prime minister. So it was one of their joint initiatives. Now, specifically he talks about this. He spoke about what's ailing Sri Lanka. Two things, lack of foreign direct investment and the diversification of our export basket of goods. Steel, tea, rubber, coconut, our labor and all of that.
50 years ago.
50 years ago. Vietnam, on the other hand, has gone ahead because they diversified and so on. I may not agree with everything, but anyway, those are the two recommendations made by him. These are not Marxist. These are capitalist economists. So he specifically talks about this. And he says, in the terms of attracting investment, they found, and I am quoting, labor regulations are strict in Sri Lanka, but they are not a binding constraint. This is his report. And he goes on to say, this finding differs from a common view of observers of Sri Lankan economy. You see, it's very clear. He says there may be some regulation that could be changed to improve productivity on the margin, but Sri Lanka's traditional exporting industries would find it more difficult to attract workers if labor regulations were scaled back. There you have it, straight from Hausmann. He goes on to say, this is very interesting. There is no strong evidence suggesting that labor regulations are binding for new export industries either. Sri Lanka's labor standards, strong labor standards are an often mentioned draw for investors who whose brands whose customers value ethically sourced products. So that gives the lie. In fact, the minister, when he came to the first meeting, I was there, he said this. He said, you know, investors won't come because we can hire but we can't fire. We can open companies but we can't close them. That's not what he's saying. And you know, the shameful thing is the Employees Federation of Sri Lanka, who's supposed to be, you know, they are supposed to be on the side of employees, but you expect them to be more, you know, developed in their views about labor. They came and spoke at that meeting. And you know, the first amendment they suggested, Charlene, was the change to the Termination of Employment of Workers Act.
To bring in a hire and fire policy.
Absolutely. Let me again quote Harvard on that specific point about this myth that the termination of employment of workers is inhibiting. Here's what the study says, and I'm quoting. The most commonly cited regulatory constraint on labor is the Termination of Employment of Workmen Act, TEWA, which dates back to 1971. The fact that this policy was in place all through Sri Lanka's last wave of structural transformation suggests that it was not binding in the past. Likewise, the source of government industry, which is high labor intensive, is strong evidence that labor regulations are not a binding constraint to export diversification and FDI, specifically export diversification and FDI. So you see, they talk about the Termination of Workers or Employment Act, and I said this is not the kind of investment you need. It's like the analogy I take is tourism. I mean, I am quite happy for cheap, low spending tourists to come. We don't support the fact that only high spenders should come. Anybody should come to Sri Lanka, but that won't get us the numbers we need. So the tourist industry, all the hoteliers and all, they plan to bring high spenders, like what Maldives is doing. You don't sell this as a cheap destination. Why don't they do that? Why don't they say, Sri Lanka, come and cheapest destination, you get dirty hotels for cheap, you know, and no standards. You know, we don't have any standards for our hotels. You can have a toilet in the middle of the room, you can have dirty drains, you can have ugly kitchens. Surely, man, that's the analogy. So, we don't say that. So, you need a high spender. So, this is to support the most exploitative employers, and that's not going to get us out of the woods.
So, Peter, there is, of course, a lot to speak about changes that are being brought in by this government. Of course, like you brought up, there is that issue of legitimacy. It is, of course, a legal government. It's been appointed and is functioning according to or within the constraints of the Constitution. But as to if or not they enjoy the mandate of the people is a different matter entirely. We'll cross over to a short commercial break, and on the other side, we will speak about how trade unions feature in this discussion. Trade unions were involved in the Aragalaya last year. There were many trade unions that came out, but trade unions were also involved in certain protests that at times did inconvenience the people. There was allegations made that they are trying to cripple the system. We'll discuss on these matters and much more after this short commercial break. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Newsline live.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
President meets Tamil political parties, discusses terrorism bill, lands and national issue. Sambandhan requests Modi to urge the president to fulfill commitments given to India. A fast in Colombo demanding the immediate resignation of the health minister. Kelly Rambukwala responds to allegations. Parliament approves the SLPP proposal for a select committee on the National Election Commission. 9 leading liquor manufacturing companies granted a 3-month payment schedule to settle tax arrears of 7 billion rupees. Omalpe Sobidutero calls for general election.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Welcome back to Newsline. We're in discussion with Peter de Almeida, the Deputy General Secretary of the CMU. Peter, we were discussing about changes that are being proposed to the labor laws here in Sri Lanka. You said that labor laws, if at all, should be strengthened on the perspective of protecting the employees rather than weakened in that front. But Speaking of employees, and you were critical about the conduct of the Sri Lanka Employers Federation, Salon Employers Federation, but let's take a little bit of a look about how employees have been functioning now. It's a known fact that there are many trade unions in Sri Lanka. Trade unions are protected under the constitution, their right to freedom of expression. They have freedom to protest, albeit a little bit restricted right now. And when these trade unions exercise their freedoms to win over whatever rights that they feel that they should have, there is the point where sometimes the general public are inconvenienced, and it's not uncommon to see people, even on television, blaming trade unions, scolding trade unions, saying, you know, these trade unions are the reason why Sri Lanka is in this position. So another argument that's been brought, at least in favor of these labor law reforms, is the fact that with these trade unions, when investors see these trade unions, they don't feel like coming and investing in Sri Lanka and working in such an environment.
Not true at all. Not true at all. The more enlightened companies have extremely advanced employee relations. That's not true. This is primitive notion. It's a very primitive notion. Now we go for negotiations, and there are some companies with whom we provide the data, and we have meaningful negotiations. I mean, we analyze their balance sheet and say, look, I mean, here is where you are. Now, isn't it a fair share of that profit should be shared with our employees? So we have enlightened conversations. But there are also the backward companies, you know, that want to stick to the bare minimum. Now, talking about inconveniencing, let's talk about the workers today, Charlene, for a minute so that your viewers understand the situation. Now, today, because of massive inflation of 70%, the worker's salary, real wage. So if you get a nominal wage, a rupee wage of 20,000, do you know that it's worth only 6,000 today? That's how their real wage has been decimated. Secondly, the cost of living is staggering. Now, they say inflation has come down. Inflation is not the cost of living. Inflation is the speed at which the prices are rising. It's still rising at 45%. You should have single-digit inflation. When you have double-digit, you are in trouble, like in UK today. So, point number 2, cost of living, they just can't make it. Point number 3, their retirement fund is now got hammered because of the debt restructuring. It's worth exactly half that 3.4 trillion. Verity has done some study. Today, it's worth 1.6 trillion. So, their retirement benefit, which they are supposed to maintain a living standard, has dropped. You know, there are companies today where a woman who works 40 hours overtime comes to work every day, because if she doesn't, she gets the attendance bonus. 2 days she can stay away. If the child fall ill, if she doesn't come, she doesn't get the attendance bonus. If you don't get the attendance bonus, you don't get your productivity bonus. You know, today, after 19 years of work in a large company, she's still short of 9,620 rupees to meet her basic needs. So what is the role of the Minister of Labour? Talking about inconveniencing, look at the standard of our living wages of our people. So what is the role of the Labour Department? The immediate thing he must do, if he's any consciousness, if it's worth his position, Minister of Labour, he's not Minister of Investment. Labour is to ensure that there's a minimum living wage of at least 50,000. Now there's a study that has said 84,000 for a family of 4. At today it's 14,000, 16,000. I mean, that's his first priority. You were talking a little bit about health. Look at our health. Our health system is collapsing. There is a person I know, she goes to the hospital, Maharagama. She says, we can't give you the injection, buy it from outside, 80,000. This is what our working people face. See, this context that these obnoxious laws are being brought so that they can continue to exploit. Is this the kind of modern society they talk about? You know, we want a technologically advanced society.
By 2048.
This is what technologically advanced society looks like. Where people are in absolute starvation. These are working people who go to companies that claim to be the top 10, the top 100, the top 500. These are not shops on the street. These are these companies that pay them starvation wages. And now you bring, so they know the situation is going to get worse.
When you say they, you mean the government?
The government knows the situation is going to get worse, so they need a workforce that's subservient, that can be controlled. That's why it's not coincidental that you bring the anti-terrorism bill, you bring the broadcast authority bill. Why is all this happening? Does any of these bills help to improve the situation in the country? In conclusion, the one of the key constraints according to the Harvard study that's stopping investors coming is, as I said, corruption. That was not in the report, but everybody knows this. Second, inconsistent policy. You see what happened with the tax break? The president came, Gotabaya Rajapaksa came, which nobody asked for. Did anybody say that's inconveniencing us? These same fellows who complain, who have a good life, they didn't complain. They knew it's going to cause a 600 to 900 billion loss in our revenue. The Employees Federation didn't care a damn about that. The Chamber of Commerce didn't care a damn about that. And they come and tell us that these labor laws that give some minimum protection to working people is stopping investment. I mean, hypocrisy. You see. So I'll leave it at that.
Peter, regarding these trade unions,
yes,
and the protest movements that the trade unions stage,
yeah,
sometimes there are claims that these demands are unreasonable, and that them getting out on the street,
yeah,
and bringing to a halt,
yes,
the economic activities of people in Sri Lanka is not really worth the gain that they're expecting, especially at a time like this when the country is in crisis.
So you see, when you say country is in crisis, who is the country? The country also means its people. So the people are in a worse crisis for a sin they never committed. Now, has the government gone after the people who got the 600 billion tax break? No. Had they gone after the high investors who are holding bonds? They're not. So, when people like this, how else are they to win their demands? How did we win the voting right? How did we throw out the British? By not inconveniencing people.
How did the people throw out the previous government?
Exactly, exactly. So you see, I mean, inconvenience is a very relative word. It's the inconvenienced who have to come out. So those who are highly convenienced will find it inconvenient. So what is so special about that? So the guy who gets on his fat big car and fully air conditioned, door to door, he goes into office, lift is air conditioned, so of course he'll find it inconvenient. But those who are socially conscious, he'll say, you know, we are with the side of the people. Now supposing people come out against the deaths that are happening in hospital, about the, you know, the cheap, so-called cheap drugs that are being brought with no standards. Of course it will inconvenience people, but it will also save lives. Suppose the doctors come out on that and they run only emergency services. People will say, but of course they are the larger interest of the greater majority of the people. Somebody will get inconvenienced when you have action. But action is meant to make their living standards better. And when is the last time a trade union action has crippled the government to the extent that has brought about this crisis? So, you know, I don't want to even go there, Shalan. The well-off would find anything inconvenient, you know. And when they were inconvenienced, they came out, now they are okay, so they are back, you know, waving the flag for the present establishment. But that's not our concern. We are more concerned about what needs to be done to protect the living standards. I'm telling you, the children, the parents today cannot give their children the standard of living that they had. And society is to improve and advance and have better standard of living. We are going in the opposite direction. So it is incumbent on the trade unions, and that's the sad thing. The unions have to come together. Some of them are controlled politically, and most of the unions have been weakened because of this manpower, this obnoxious practice where they outsource workers with no rights. And this law now strengthens this obnoxious practice of manpower. Manpower is, Charlan, when you hire people, the company doesn't hire. They get some contractor to provide and say, I don't know, you're not my employee. But he comes to work there every day. So it's a means of undermining. Now the government is strengthening this kind of practice. So it's a very tough time ahead. But I'm hoping that the unions, even those who are controlled politically, will come together and, you know, do some lunch hour picketing. We did that. We defeated JR's laws to prevent strikes at the height of JR's government's power. They had 5/6 majority in 1979. A year after he became the all-powerful president, we defeated it. Because the unions came together, lunch hour picketing, that's all we did. So, no stopping our work, lunch hour, we come out, picket every day in front of our companies. And I'm hoping that the unions come together, they can fight pushback. Because this law is not going to bring the type of investment that we need for for this country to come out of this mess, which is high quality investment, and they are looking for other competitive advantage. It's not to provide them with a broken, compliant, subservient, working people to make money. No, that's not what's going to pull us out of this mess.
Peter, now you've worked with your employees on these matters. With the things that are happening in Sri Lanka right now, how do you see these reforms to labor laws panning out in the future? I know you're not a soothsayer, but with the experience that you've had in handling these matters and how people rise up and fight against what they don't want, or how the government imposes their way on the general public, how do you think this will pan out in the current context?
The current labor laws,
yes,
they must be defeated.
The proposed reforms?
Yes, must be absolutely defeated. There's no way in which we can rest with a clear conscience that we have not done everything we can, everything we can legally to defeat this, because this will spell the death of our workers. It will completely destroy their living standards, and the dependence. Millions of people will face absolute depredation and deprivation of their standard of living. So it has to be defeated.
But Peter, since the height of
I just mentioned, you spoke about our companies. Now, how did we run our companies? Now, how did the IT companies, are they hiding behind labor laws to hire people? They, without anybody asking, said, the dollar is rising. They had a social consciousness. They said, our dollar exports, we are getting more rupees. They pegged the salaries to the dollar. Nobody asked them to. That is what it takes to be a more enlightened employer. Now, our company, we were completely transparent. People knew my salary. So, they could know my salary. So, every quarter we share all our information, the profit margin, our problems, the bank loans, and then we share our profits. It's very open. And there's a formula. Everybody is comfortable. Otherwise, they'll form a union. And then we negotiated with their union. And they had every right to form a union. That is more enlightened, way of engaging with your employees. But that's not this. So I'm saying that's the kind of change we need, where employees and employees come together and they understand what are our competitive positioning and work towards that. Not to make money by cutting the wages of your own workers, your so-called stakeholders that they talk about proudly in the annual reports.
Thank you very much, Peter de Almeida, Deputy General Secretary of the CMU, for joining us on our program and sharing these very insightful thoughts, of course, a little bit away from common parlance or common understandings of these things, because people usually say we need change.
For sure.
But then as to if this is the kind of change we need is a entirely different question. Thank you very much again, Peter, for joining us on our program. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in to another episode of Newsline. We will continue to bring you the latest details from things that will affect your lives during this crisis here in Sri Lanka. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.